Chapter 9. Pain and Anxiety. Cloud awoke to nothing but darkness. He opened and closed his eyes several times before he realized that he was not in a dark place, he merely had a blindfold tied over his eyes. It was tied well enough to prevent him from being able to remove it simply by nodding his head, but not so tight as to cause him pain. He was lying on the ground, on his stomach, with his hands bound tightly behind his back. His feet were free, but what good did that do, unless he could figure out how to use them to untie his hands? Groaning, he attempted to get up. The floor he was on was hard and cold, and very uncomfortable to lay upon. He tried several times but only managed to roll himself onto his back. He sat up and then decided to scoot himself against the wall, where maybe he could find something protruding to snag his binds onto so that he could remove them and break free. He found the wall, used it to stand up, but could find nothing to help him. He slid back down to the floor, disappointed. His body was aching. He could still feel the tingling in his body where Reno had zapped him with his EMR. He cursed. "I'm going to kill him," he muttered. He was going to kick the living hell out of Reno when he saw him again. Then he was going to make sure to slam Root's head into a wall, with the glasses on, and then make sure it was embedded into his skull. Violent thoughts entered his head, but he reasoned with himself, he had every reason to be mad. He was attacked, albeit again, but for what reason? Was it a challenge? Did those two want Aerith as well? Whatever the reason, and most likely it had to do with Aerith, and Cloud was still furious. Now he was left bound and blind in some cell, with his body aching, and his head pounding. How long had he been passed out? Despite how long it could have been, Cloud was sure it was not that long. He felt so exhausted. Taking in a large breath, Cloud leaned his head back against the wall. Minutes dragged by slowly, at a snail's pace, and Cloud was becoming steadily agitated when a second later, the sound of a mechanical swoosh echoed through his cell. Someone had entered the room, their footsteps clicking along the metal floor. Whoever it was suddenly stopped, and Cloud was sure that the person was near him. No, he was positive, he was right next to him, within kicking distance. Cloud wanted to kick the man's feet from under him, but with his hands bound tightly, he was sure it would be pointless to try. "I know you are awake and I know you can stand," the voice said. Cloud expected it to be Reno or Root, but it was neither. The voice sounded more refined and held a no-nonsense attitude about it. "So do it." Cloud swallowed. Every inch of him wanted to deny his demand, but he obeyed. He slid his body up, using the wall for support. His legs began to burn. Why did it hurt more now than just moments ago? He thought, as he winced. Finally standing, Cloud waited for his next command, but none came. Instead, he was shoved forward and out the door. He stumbled, and worried that he would smack into a wall or something and injure himself, but the man pushed him down a hall, guiding him. Cloud continued to walk, and only stopped when the man shoved him in another direction. He was instructed to halt once and he waited until he heard a ding. The sound of doors opened and he was pushed inside. The doors behind him closed. Cloud breathed. "I suggest you close your eyes," the man said, before untying the blindfold and snatching the cloth off of him. Cloud shut his eyes, and a flash of light invaded his vision through his closed eyelids. He could feel the bright light on his face, and tried to open his eyes several times, but found it much too painful at first, too much of a contrast to the darkness he had begun getting used to. It took him a good minute before he could open his eyes and see clearly again. He looked at the man next to him just as he pressed the button to the elevator. This man was dressed just like Reno and Root, but if possible, even more neatly pressed than Root. He had pale skin and dark eyes, with his hair was slicked back and tied in a ponytail. On his forehead was a single dot, a chaluk. "Where am I?" Cloud asked. The man did not respond. "Why was I kidnapped? Who are you?" The man ignored him still. He then took out a small knife and with a quick move, undid the bounds holding Cloud. Cloud rubbed his wrists, now raw and red, and looked back up at the man. "Aren't you afraid I might attack you?" Cloud asked bluntly. The man smirked knowingly. "It would be foolish of you to try, especially since you do not know where you are. If you try escaping, you will simply be apprehended again. So why am I here?" "The President wishes to meet with you." "The President? You have been in Midgar for how long now?" "Not long, really." "Surprising, the President is not some obscure person. It is common knowledge to all the residents of Midgar as well as many other cities and towns." It was Cloud's turn to smirk. "I'm from Nibelheim, it's a small town and pretty dull." The door to the elevator opened. The man held out his hand for Cloud to exit first. Cloud was apprehensive to go first, but considering this man could possibly be holding a weapon other than the small knife, he decided to go. He exited to a small floor with a set of steps in front of him, and looked back once before climbing them. Once he reached the top, he found himself in a large room, with a long window that covered the back wall. There was a table with candles lit and gourmet food prepared in the center. At one end of the table, he saw a man covered in a white blanket, sitting in a wheelchair, with only his hand visible. Next to him was a woman, dressed similarly to the black-haired man, in a neat suit. She had short blonde hair. Cloud's eyes traveled to the other end of the table and he sucked in a sharp breath. At the other end of the table sat Aerith, cutting into some food on her plate. "President Shinra," the black-haired man said, "our guest is here." The man under the blanket looked over. Though Cloud could not see his face from under the blanket, he was sure the president could see him. "Aerith, your bodyguard is here," said the president, his voice calm. Aerith looked up at the same time, placing her silverware down. She slid out of her chair, preparing to go to Cloud's side. However, Reno and Rude, who had been standing there the entire time, moved to intercept her. She stopped and looked over at the president. He held his hand up and the two allowed Aerith to pass. She moved toward Cloud. "Are you hurt?" Cloud asked. Aerith shook her head and smiled up at Cloud. "Rufus would never harm me." "Rufus?" Cloud asked. "How rude of me," the man in the wheelchair said. "Allow me to introduce myself, although forgive me for not standing. I am Rufus Shinra, president of Shinra Electric Company. These are my bodyguards, known as the Turks. You have already met Reno and Rude. This charming young lady is Elena and that man is the leader of the Turks, Tseng." "Cloud stiff," Cloud said through clenched teeth. Rufus laughed softly. "Forgive me for not inviting you to dine, but I had wanted to speak to Aerith in private before inviting you to join in on our conversation." Cloud looked down at Aerith. She was dressed in a pink and green dress, strapless and breezy. She looked as if she had taken time to prepare herself before arriving with dinner with President Shinra. He wondered if it was because the two had known each other before or because she thought it be embarrassing to come dressed in something not suitable to meet someone of high class. Regardless, Aerith's demeanor annoyed Cloud. "What do you want with me?" Cloud finally asked. Rufus moved his wheelchair around. "The same thing everyone else wants." He paused as if for a dramatic effect before saying, "Aerith." The moment he said this, Tseng threw Cloud's sword in front of him. Cloud picked it up. Was he actually going to fight a man in a wheelchair? "So, I am supposed to fight you?" the blonde swordsman asked. "Does that bother you?" Rufus Shinra replied. Cloud shook his head. "Doesn't it seem a bit unfair?" Rufus smirked. "Are you ready to fight?" Cloud looked back at Aerith once again. She nodded her head and then moved away, instantly being surrounded by the Turks. Cloud wondered why they were acting like human shields. It was not as if the fight would get out of hand. He had nothing against a man in a wheelchair, but the president had a clear disadvantage. "Can't we talk about this?" he tried to reason to the president. He did not want to hurt someone so feeble. Rufus smirked again. "No. Suddenly, the man whipped the blanket that had been draped over him and held out a silver metallic gun, abruptly pulling the trigger. 3 shots rang out, and Cloud felt the 3 bullets graze him. He let out a gasp, watching blood drip from his arms. Blood masked his face as it dripped down from his temple. He looked at the president, dressed in all white with pale blonde hair. One eye covered with a white cloth, his free hand looking oddly bruised as well as his face. At first Cloud thought that the president had missed, but he soon realized the president was proving a point. He was making sure Cloud realized the seriousness of the situation. Yet, what startled Cloud the most was if he was an able fighter, why did he not walk around? Why stay confined in a wheelchair? That was your only warning, Rufus stated. Cloud gripped his sword tightly. His body was still aching and the sword felt much heavier than it normally did. He knew he was tired, but he pushed all the aches and pains that his body was using to beg for him to rest away. He had to concentrate on here and now, on this fight. Rufus moved with great speed. Cloud could not risk blinking, or he would have missed blocking the man attacking him. Cloud blocked a barrage of bullets with his sword before meeting Rufus head-on. The president parried his attack and smacked the swordsman with the back of his head gun. Cloud stumbled before regaining himself. He then spun around, blindly swiping but only being met with air. Rufus smirked and then fired again. Cloud rolled across the ground. Squatting, he pushed himself to fly at Rufus. The president once again parried the attack, then hit Cloud in the stomach with his knee. His breath was gone and Cloud then felt the president's fists come down on his back. The pain enveloped him as he felt his entire body shudder. He pushed it back, using all his will to force the excruciating pain to nothing more than a small poke. Cloud pulled himself up, but Rufus cocked his gun and aimed it straight into Cloud's face. Blue eyes widened slightly. Cloud looked up past the barrel to the president. "I think I..." His voice started confident as he spoke, but then it began to shrink. 1. Rufus's body involuntarily began convulse. Cloud noticed the bruises on his hand even more, leading to the veins then were now pulsating. Taking advantage, Cloud knocked Rufus's hand away. He then kicked the man, and slammed his fist into his face, effectively knocking off the white cloth from around the one eye. He then threw the man across the room. Running, Cloud prepared to strike Rufus, but the man recovered, firing a bullet causing Cloud to dodge. Rufus got up, cursing to himself, and then began firing more bullets at Cloud. The sporadic way Rufus was fighting made Cloud notice how desperate the man seemed. Why? Why was he so desperate to beat him? Did he want Aerith that much? What was she exactly to him or to everyone who he had defeated up to this point? The desperation, however, was good enough for Cloud. It gave him advantage. He moved up toward Rufus, zigzagging his way to dodge bullets. As he went to slash at the president, the man did a backward bend that not only dodged a bullet but also kicked of his feet that sent Cloud soaring to the back of the room and skidding across the floor before hitting the back window. The pain came back and for a moment Cloud wanted to succumb to it. He opened his eyes watching Rufus run at him, preparing to end this fight. How he wanted to sleep, how he wanted to quit this fighting. It was too much. He closed his eyes. "Cloud, don't say such lies." "But I am not lying. Aerith, I'll protect you now." Cloud opened his eyes, which began to glow, and then the second Rufus tried to shoot him, he threw his sword at him, knocking the gun from his hand. Then he grabbed him by the arm and flipped him over and through the glass window behind him. The spectators looked on with disbelief, but then as if on cue went running toward the window. The Turks, one after the other, jumped out the window after their president. Aerith on the other hand knelt down to Cloud, who used her hand to help him stand. The two looked out the window together and watched as the 4 Turks did several intricate stunts in the air before somehow saving Rufus with a safety net. Cloud almost wanted to ask why none of the Turks did not challenge him, because they looked like very smart and calculating men and women. Not to mention very well prepared for anything. Yet, Cloud kept his mouth shut because that was the last thing he wanted to do. He was done, he won this fight and his body was now screaming at him for rest. As if she knew what he was thinking, Aerith slung one of Cloud's arms over her shoulder. She looked up at him smiling cheerfully, which caught Cloud off guard. "Let's get you home, Cloud, you need your rest," she said. Aerith led him through the building, knowing which way to turn as if she had been here before. Cloud would have asked, but each step he took felt like he was walking on sharp stones. His legs on fire, cramping. Once in the lobby, Cloud and Aerith came face to face with Rufus again, returned to his wheelchair. It was then Cloud noticed bruising all around his eye, much like the ones on his hand. "Congratulations," Rufus said bitterly. "Now please vacate the premises immediately or I will have you escorted out." "Wait!" Cloud called, stopping Rufus from leaving. "You're ill. Why are you fighting for Aerith when it should be your life you are fighting for?" Rufus turned his head slightly, looking at Cloud out of the corner of his eye. "I am," Rufus said, and with that he left. Cloud watched him go and wanted to ask more questions to the president had it not been for Aerith urging him to leave before Reno and Rude got violent with the swordsman. Cloud obliged only because his body was ready to collapse. The two walked back to Cloud's apartment. Once there, Aerith helped Cloud onto his bed. He sat there, feeling his body tingling and a small amount of relief washed over him. "Cloud, why are you still wearing my ribbon around your arm?" Aerith asked. "It's dirty, you should throw it away." So Aerith noted that Cloud was still wearing the ribbon. He did not know why he was wearing it, maybe because he felt he had to. Maybe because that was what reminded him of his promise. A promise he wanted to break during the fight. How could anyone blame him? Aerith acted as though it was all normal, and as if his suffering was only a minor paper cut rather than life-threatening. "I was hoping that Rufus would not have taken so long with the fight," Aerith continued. "I need to go take care of the flowers. They'll die without me. I worry so much about them." She looked out Cloud's window. "It's strange how everyone just wants to fight you all of a sudden. Don't you agree?" "You?" Cloud mumbled something. Aerith turned to look at him. "Pardon? It's all because of you," Cloud snapped. Aerith gasped softly, startled by the sharpness in his words. Cloud glared at her as he stood up, his whole body rippling in pain, begging him to go sit back down. "Sign I've met you. I have been punched, kicked, shot, stabbed, blown up, and it's all because of you." Aerith backed herself into a wall as Cloud began taking slow steps toward her. Each step caused him to wince painfully. Aerith stared at him and he back at her. "Why?" As if time had slowed, Cloud's body collapsed. All energy left in his body was spent. His eyes rolled back and he landed on his knees. He stayed that way for a brief moment. Aerith did not blink, she did not let out a breath that she was holding. "Why are you so important?" Cloud's eyes closed. His world was going black as every feeling in his battered and bruised body evaporated. Cloud finally collapsed completely to the ground, face down. Aerith stared down at him, she let out her breath and then blinked once. Meekly, she knelt down before Cloud and turned his head to the side gently. She pushed back several of his blonde locks and looked at his face, finally sleeping peacefully. Aerith's bright green eyes looked sadly and then looked away from the blonde. To be continued.